Thank you for joining us today. It's wonderful to see you all. And so our latest NZBCA webinar is by Phil Guerin on pursuing excellence, snapshots of innovation and international best practice. And just two reminders that it's a 30-minute presentation followed by Q&A at the end. So we should be finished by 12:45 p.m. And as usual, we are recording the session and it will be available on our YouTube channel for everyone to see, and the slides will be sent out as well. So today's presenter, Phil Guerin from Hague Consulting Limited. If you would like to get started.
Sure. Hi, I'm Phil Guerin, and this is just a little bit about me, so you kind of understand where I'm coming from. And so I've worked in public and private sector, but I've mostly been a consultant for a long time, and I've been exposed to lots of forms of organisational excellence for a long time and used it a lot in my work, everything from benchmarking to value stream mapping and Six Sigma and all sorts of other things. But essentially it's just about taking a holistic approach to performance of organisations. And that just gives you a little bit of my background. So firstly, what is excellence? Can I just, sorry. I'm just getting rid of something on my screen. Okay, so excellence is about experimentation. And it's about looking for better ways to do things. So I just really liked that quote. So I'm going to just kick off by going through what pursuing excellence looks like, and then I'm going to run through a couple of elements of that, and then I'm going to share some examples of what excellence can look like, and then we're going to have a chance to have some questions and discussions about that. So here are some of the things that I've picked up over the years working with excellence colleagues around the world. So one of the first things I find people do is they find out what they don't know, and to do that they look beyond their organisation and they look beyond their country, and often they look beyond their own industry as well and sector. They set stretch goals, if you like, and then they commit thoroughly to the goal, which is one of the most important things, is to actually have that real commitment, but also to be open to feedback on new information, because sometimes things don't work out quite how we plan. Another thing is that there are two main areas of excellence. One is innovation and one is continuous improvement, and sometimes people think that those two things are in conflict, but they're not at all, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And it's about the customer. It's always about the customer and how you can make their experience better. But it's also about your own people, and it's very hard to focus on having a really good customer experience if you don't have a good internal team experience. So that's just my summary of some of the strongest characteristics of excellent organisations, and I'll go into some of the negatives a bit later. And the other thing at the end of all of that is to learn from what you do and do it better next time. I just want to talk a little bit about vision, because I'm just having a lot of recurring conversations about people at the moment, particularly as we enter into another political cycle, that vision is really, really important. Is where are you going? And business confidence is pretty much about people believing that tomorrow is going to be better than today, and that next week or next month or next year is going to be better than this one. And to do that, you have to have some idea of what that's going to be like. And that means knowing where you're going and having that reinforced by actions and results. and committing to that. And committing means obviously you're going to have ups and downs, you're going to have obstacles, you're going to have sometimes you're going to have to come to a dead end and try another route, and that's what builds resilience. And working as a team through those constraints and those obstacles is what creates the unity. And I just think this is important because so much vision stuff is about buzzwords and so on, but where I've seen real vision in successful organizations, it tends to have these characteristics. So I just wanted to share that. This is an example of, this is from the latest international best practice competition, which is happening at the moment. And this is just one session on that. And I just pulled this one out just to give an example of what vision looks like in organizations that are actually doing it really well. And these are just 3 entries in a best practice competition from 3 quite different organizations. And these are all relating to what putting vision into practice means. There's one there about the Malaysian one, which is about innovation for both sustainability and profitability. Again, showing that things that appear to be in conflict aren't. And the Ajman Police one, they're having a day just to focus on values. And that's what I mean by regularly reinforcing what your vision is, actually doing something practical about it. And then the third one is another UAE example, which is around building a learning culture through safety intelligence. And what that's doing is saying we want to be safe, so let's just make that an integral part of our culture, and let's reinforce that with actions and artifacts and celebrations along the way. So just some practical examples of really proactive leadership initiatives that reinforce vision. And I just liked this cartoon. I just saw it on LinkedIn recently. That vision isn't something that you overlay on top of a really broken organization. It actually represents the whole way your organization works, and it needs to be demonstrated, and it needs to be reinforced, and it needs to be supported, and it needs to be real. And it's one thing I really notice in the organizations that I look at around the world that are doing really amazing things is when you talk to people throughout the organization, from the leadership to the people in the middle to the people on the front line, they're all giving you slightly different perspectives, but they're all reinforcing that vision. And you see it when you talk to people, you see it when you look around their premises, and you see it when you see the interactions with customers. So it's a real thing. It's not words on a page. It's not a poster. It's something that you see demonstrated in the organization. So I just want to talk a little bit about benchmarking, because benchmarking is one way that you can set your targets. So we all know that if we want to succeed, we have to have a picture of what the end goal is. What does it actually look like? And one of the drivers for benchmarking is making sure that you and the people you work with know what excellence looks like, and then benchmark against it. And this is where it gets interesting, because the reason for benchmarking is so that you know what the current best looks like, so that you can at least match that and potentially exceed it. Or if your work is truly really, really different, then you move to a whole new level and you set a new benchmark. And one of the organizations I worked with recently did exactly that. They benchmarked around the world. That didn't mean they traveled around the world. They could do it from their office. But they looked at what people were doing in the area, which was around government finance in the space. And they saw some things, some ways that they could tweak what they did and make it a little bit better. But they wanted to achieve something, and they found that they couldn't find anyone around the world who actually did what they wanted to do. So they made sure that they were doing all the right bits in the basics, but then they moved way beyond that, and they invented something completely new that I've never seen anywhere else in the world. And then they integrated that into the whole operation across their public sector. And so what they were doing was they were seeing what best looked like at the moment, and then they said, well, that's great, we can do all of those things, but we're going to move way beyond that. So it's not about copying or saying there's a limit on what you can do. It's about seeing what's possible and then looking, if necessary, to go way beyond that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a few examples, and these are all examples from best practices that I've seen over the last few years from different countries. And I'm going to go through these as an example of what a best practice might look like. And this is mainly just to show that there's a huge variety in what a best practice looks like and how it's expressed. This one here is a steel company in Iran. I've had lots of conversations with businesses in Iran, not in the last year or so, because obviously things are a bit tricky. But one of the things that I find with Iranians is that they tend to often be very innovative. They've had sanctions for years. They've got all kinds of issues, but they also have massive industrial organizations, petrochemical plants, polymer plants, paint plants, all sorts of things. These things are often very, very big, and they often cannot buy the technology they need because of sanctions and other things. And so they have to develop it themselves or replace things themselves. And these are very, very big operations. And so this one here is an example of a people system, if you like, rather than an information system that's been brought in. This integrated action management system is in effect a continuous improvement approach, a very, very systematic continuous improvement approach. And it encompasses small fixes right through to much more significant projects that take quite some time. And I'll just show you this diagram first, and it just gives an example of what it looks like. They've got improvement projects, they've got quick fixes, and they've got a master projects portfolio. And they have a whole structure inside the organization around this at different levels so that things can feed up and down and so on. But the most significant part of this is the next slide. And this is the impact that has had. Now, what we've got here is they've mapped here the actions, the improvement projects, and the quick fixes compared to the steel production level. And what they've done is they've managed to increase total crude steel production by 15% without expanding the plant. Now that's massive. That's absolutely massive. So what they've done, it's a big steel plant. What they have done is by effectively changing the way that they let ideas flow through their organization to increase their steel production by 15% without investing in new plant, new equipment, or expanding the footprint of their plant. That's pretty huge, and that's why I particularly like this example, because it shows the power of people rather than just throwing investment at something. And it's something that I think makes a real difference. They say some of the best performance comes from tight constraints. Architects will often say that, and I think this is a prime example of that. This one here is a completely different example. This one's from Thailand. This is a fairly significant private hospital. It treats around 480,000 people every year. So it's a big, big operation. And what they had done is they'd looked around the world at the way that hospitals measured their performance and what they did, and they just weren't very happy with it. And what they saw a lot of was people focused on what got measured. And so when you measured the inputs at different points, or you measured a very small number of outputs, then you skewed behavior to give you the measures that were going to get you rewarded. So what they did is they said, well, what really matters? What are we here for? And what they were here for ultimately was customer experience, or patient experience and outcomes in this case. And that meant not just transactionally in terms of how quickly you get people out of a hospital bed and back home, but in terms of their overall health and their outcomes over the long term. And so what they did is they moved to a whole performance management system around the value to the customer of what they were doing, and really turn that around. So just really interesting to see that happen. And this is in a for-profit enterprise. So what they're saying is that for them, the long-term customer value is actually beneficial to them as a profit center as well. So very interesting. This next one here is a best practice from the best practice competition. This is from a charitable trust in Pakistan, and it owns a whole lot of hospitals, diagnostic centres and labs all around Pakistan. And one of the problems they have in Pakistan is that they are a relatively low-income country, and but they're still a modern country, and so when they buy medical equipment, a lot of it comes from Europe and the US, and it's very, very, very expensive for them, given the funds that they have available and so on. So one of the things that is very tricky in Pakistan is maintaining temperature and humidity in a medical clinical environment, particularly in laboratories, because if you don't have the materials that you're using in the environment that you're working in at the right temperature and humidity, then all your results become suspect. So it's very, very important to do that. But the problem is that they were using a data logger device. You can see on the left there, the fancy little thing that sits on a wall, which was very, very expensive, and they couldn't afford to buy enough of them to put them in all the places where they needed to have them. So what they did is they created an investment program to develop their own versions. Now those versions, the first version that you see here, doesn't have quite the, if you look at the temperature range it covers, it doesn't have quite the same range as the more expensive one that we're buying, but they've put another. They were working on the next version of this when I talked to them a while ago, and then they've moved on to another version again since, which exceeds the externally purchased one. But what they've done here is they've developed a medical device which is essential for operating their centres for 10% of the cost of the internationally available device. And more importantly than that, because of the way it works, they don't have the ongoing costs involved in supporting that through specialist data links. So what they've been able to do is they've now got a device which works better than the purchased ones at an asset cost of 10% of the original and a much lower operating cost. So pretty amazing example of getting more for an awfully lot less. And you wouldn't necessarily think of Pakistan as being a country that could do something so radical and come up with that kind of improvement, but they did. This next one is completely different. This is from Eswatini, and this is a triumph of both technology and politics in an environmental situation. I talked to the team who developed this, and fascinating conversation. So basically, you've got 3 countries that share a watershed that is critical for drinking water, for crops, for industry, and basically for survival in Eswatini, Mozambique, and South Africa. So you've got different languages, you've got different politics, you've got economics versus environment, because there's a risk of drought, a risk of floods, and obviously if you've got water, you can drive economic activity, and if you don't, you can't. So they had a very fractured way of collecting data on this, and they needed a common data system that they could trust. And this is a system developed to collect that data and share it. And an awful lot of community consultation and negotiation and horse trading went on to make this happen. But just a great project and a great example of how you can marry technology, but only if you actually really engage with your stakeholders and build a lot of trust. So just really good example, lots of lessons in stakeholder management and technology and international relations and environmental management out of that project. This one is another extreme. This is the biggest company in the world, Saudi Aramco, and only a small proportion of the shares are actually traded, but it's still the biggest in the world. Saudi Arabia is quite a big country, and a lot of it is just desert. And crisscrossing that country are an awful lot of pipelines. And when there are leaks in those pipes, they can be very difficult to find, and the consequences can be major. So what these are some very clever smart balls which they put into their pipelines, and they can detect and report very tiny differences in pressure, which show even a pinhole leak in an oil or gas pipe, which allow it to be repaired before it causes significant damage. I'm just showing you one slide from the presentation. There's an awful lot more to it than that, but just an example of solving a problem, which can also be used to solve water leaks. Perhaps Te Aki Wai in Wellington could benefit from something like that, given that around half Wellington's water is lost from the mains pipes before it gets to a property. So yeah, so interesting idea. This here is a little image from Harvard Business Review of digital evolution, the state and momentum, and it's showing those countries in the top right quadrant. Everyone's familiar with 4x4 scenarios, and you can see the countries up the top that are really at the forefront of digital evolution. And my little yellow arrow there shows where New Zealand is on the left and where potentially it could be on the right. And so the real question around excellence is what it takes to get there. And among the countries on the right, we have Malaysia, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, which are all countries that I regularly see, and it's displaying large numbers of best practices, and obviously South Korea and Hong Kong and there and others, and the US, obviously. So just an interesting little thought provocation there. Now, I said earlier, I said in the lead up to this that I'd also talk about some of the things that get in the way of excellence. And so this is my how-to guide if you want to pursue mediocrity. So if excellence isn't your thing, then mediocrity is there for you to choose. And here's how you get there. So the first thing you've got to do is assume that you know best. Just trust yourself, don't bother asking anybody else. Discourage curiosity, stop people from asking questions. Those pesky people who annoy you all the time, just shut them down. Set vague goals, just make them really waffly. Leave wiggle room to backtrack later. So if it doesn't work, you can just say you didn't really mean to do it after all. You shut down feedback and bad news. That worked really well with MB with their $40 million project. Jump at fads. rather than innovating for real value and defining that value and measuring it closely as you proceed. Don't get into continuous improvement. Just write that off as just tinkering and a waste of time. Forget about the steel company that increased its steel production by 15% through continuous improvement. That's not going to work for you. And just focus on big bang initiatives, things that you can put on your CV. Don't worry about anything to do with customers or anything. Just look at the big bang. I've done a big one of these, and that's me. So if you want to pursue mediocrity, there's a recipe there for you. The big thing though is if you bury failures and ignore your lessons, because the one thing that I've seen over all the years that I've worked in excellence is that organizations that succeed over and over again do so because they acknowledge their failures, they look at the lessons, they learn from them, and they move on. And they abandon things that don't work, and they do it better next time. So, biggest piece of advice out of all of that is foster your sense of curiosity to enjoy the journey.